the morning of December 29, 1890, began like any other winter day on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Snow blanketed the South Dakota plains, and the breath of over 300 Lakota men, women, and children formed clouds in the frigid air. What happened next would become one of the most controversial and misunderstood events in American history. Before we dive into this shocking true story, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because today we're uncovering the real truth behind Wounded Knee, a story that has been twisted by time and politics for over 130 years. The year was 1890. The American frontier was closing, but tensions between the U.S. government and Native American tribes had reached a boiling point. The Lakota people, led by figures like Sitting Bull and Red Cloud, were facing the complete destruction of their way of life. Their sacred lands had been seized, their buffalo herds slaughtered to near extinction, and their children forced into government schools designed to eliminate their culture. But this isn't just another story about the Indian Wars. This is the story of 15 soldiers whose fate became entangled with a religious movement that terrified the U.S. government, the Ghost Dance. A spiritual revival that promised the return of the buffalo, the resurrection of fallen warriors, and the restoration of native lands. As winter approached in 1890, something was brewing on the reservations. Something that would lead to bloodshed, controversy, and a legacy of pain that continues to this day. To understand what happened at Wounded Knee, we must first understand the Ghost Dance, a spiritual movement that emerged from the visions of a Paiute prophet named Wovoka in Nevada. Wovoka claimed that during a solar eclipse in 1889, he had died and spoken with the Great Spirit. The message he brought back would electrify Native American communities across the West. If the tribes performed a specific dance and lived in peace, the white settlers would disappear, the buffalo would return, and their ancestors would rise from the dead to reclaim their lands. The Ghost Dance wasn't violent in its original form. Wovoka preached nonviolence and harmony. But as the movement spread eastward to the Plains tribes, it evolved. The Lakota, desperate and starving on reservations where government rations were often late or spoiled, embraced this new hope with fervent intensity. By late 1890, thousands of Lakota were performing the Ghost Dance on reservations across South Dakota. They danced for days, sometimes collapsing from exhaustion, believing they were communicating with their deceased relatives and preparing for the prophesied new world. The dancing itself was mesmerizing. Hundreds of participants would join hands in a massive circle, shuffling sideways while singing sacred songs. Some dancers claimed to have visions of the spirit world, describing encounters with dead relatives and scenes of the Promised Land where native peoples lived free from white oppression. But what made the government truly nervous wasn't just the dancing, it was the ghost shirts. Lakota participants began wearing specially decorated shirts and dresses, believing these garments would make them invulnerable to bullets. Made from muslin or buckskin and painted with sacred symbols including eagles, buffalo, and spiritual designs, these ghost shirts represented ultimate faith in the prophecy. Local Indian agents reported back to Washington with growing alarm. James McLaughlin, agent at Standing Rock Reservation, wrote urgent telegrams describing the religious frenzy and warning that the movement was becoming militaristic. His reports painted a picture of thousands of fanatical Indians preparing for war. The reality was more complex. Most ghost dancers simply wanted hope. Hope that their children wouldn't starve, hope that their culture could survive, hope that the promises made in treaties might somehow be fulfilled. But fear was spreading faster than understanding. President Benjamin Harrison's administration faced a dilemma. Reports from Indian agents described massive gatherings of armed Native Americans engaged in what appeared to be war preparations. The Ghost Dance was being performed on multiple reservations simultaneously, creating what military officials saw as a coordinated threat. General Nelson Miles, commanding the Division of the Missouri, was ordered to investigate and suppress the Ghost Dance movement. Miles was a veteran Indian fighter who had pursued Geronimo and other tribal leaders across the Southwest. He understood the potential for violence when cultures collided. But Miles also recognized something that many of his subordinates missed. The Ghost Dancers weren't preparing for offensive war. They were preparing for the end of the world as they knew it, clinging to the only hope they had left. In November 1890, Miles deployed over 3,000 federal troops across the Dakotas. The 7th Cavalry Regiment, the same unit that had been decimated at Little Bighorn 14 years earlier, was among the forces sent to restore order on the reservations. The military buildup created a powder keg. Young Lakota warriors, already frustrated by years of broken promises and government oppression, saw the arrival of so many soldiers as confirmation that the whites intended to destroy them completely. Some began to arm themselves, not for conquest, but for what they believed would be their final battle. The situation was spiraling toward disaster, but what happened next would shock even seasoned military veterans. If you're finding this historical deep dive fascinating, let me know in the comments what other controversial historical events you'd like to see covered. The arrest order for Sitting Bull came on December 12, 1890. The legendary chief, living quietly on the Standing Rock Reservation, had been labeled a troublemaker by Indian Agent McLaughlin, though Sitting Bull himself had been cautious about the ghost dance movement. At dawn on December 15, 43 Indian police officers surrounded Sitting Bull's cabin. The plan was simple: arrest the chief quietly and transport him to Fort Yates for questioning. What they didn't anticipate was the reaction of Sitting Bull's followers. As the police attempted to escort the 59-year-old chief from his home, a crowd of ghost dancers gathered. Tensions escalated quickly. Someone fired a shot, historians still debate who, and within minutes, a firefight erupted. When the gun smoke cleared, Sitting Bull lay dead along with 7 of his followers and 6 Indian police officers. News of Sitting Bull's death spread across the reservations like wildfire. If the government was willing to kill the most famous Lakota leader in his own home, what safety did any of them have? Bigfoot, a Mini-Conju Lakota chief living on the Cheyenne River Reservation, felt the walls closing in. His band of about 350 people, mostly women, children, and elderly, had been performing the ghost dance, and Bigfoot knew soldiers would come for him next. On December 23, 1890, Bigfoot made a fateful decision. He would lead his people south to Pine Ridge Reservation, where Red Cloud had promised sanctuary. It was a journey of over 150 miles across winter plains, but it seemed like their only hope for survival. What Bigfoot didn't know was that he was already on the Army's list of hostile chiefs to be arrested. Major Samuel Whitside of the 7th Cavalry received his orders on December 28. Intercept Bigfoot's band before they could reach Pine Ridge. Intelligence reports suggested that the group was heavily armed and planning to join other hostile ghost dancers for a coordinated uprising. The truth was far different. Bigfoot's band was exhausted, hungry, and desperate. Many were sick with influenza and pneumonia. Bigfoot himself was so ill with pneumonia that he had to be carried on a travois, a makeshift stretcher pulled behind a horse. As Whitside's troops rode across the frozen landscape, they were joined by additional cavalry units. The force pursuing Bigfoot eventually grew to nearly 500 soldiers, equipped with 4 Hotchkiss guns, rapid-fire artillery pieces capable of devastating infantry formations. The Lakota band, meanwhile, struggled through blizzard conditions. Children cried from cold and hunger. Elderly members of the group couldn't keep up with the pace needed to stay ahead of the pursuing cavalry. Several people died during the journey, their bodies left behind on the frozen prairie. On the afternoon of December 28, Whitside scouts spotted smoke rising from the Lakota camp along Porcupine Creek. The chase was nearly over. When the cavalry approached under a flag of truce, Bigfoot was helped to his feet despite his illness. Through interpreters, Whitside explained that he had orders to escort the band to the military post at Pine Ridge for questioning. He assured Bigfoot that no harm would come to his people if they cooperated. Bigfoot, too weak to resist and knowing his people couldn't outrun the cavalry, agreed to surrender. He told Whitside that his band was peaceful, that they were simply seeking refuge with Red Cloud, and that they had no hostile intentions. Whitside seemed to accept this explanation, but his orders were clear. The entire band must be disarmed and escorted to a military camp for processing. As evening fell, he directed the Lakota to set up camp at Wounded Knee Creek, about 20 miles from Pine Ridge. The location was significant. Wounded Knee Creek ran through a shallow valley surrounded by low hills, terrain that would prove crucial in the events to follow. As the Lakota erected their teepees in the gathering darkness, few realized they were camping in what would become one of the most infamous locations in American history. That night, Colonel James Forsyth arrived with additional troops and assumed command of the operation. Forsyth was a Civil War veteran who had served with distinction during the Union campaigns in the South. But dealing with desperate native families was different from fighting Confederate soldiers. Forsyth positioned his men strategically around the Lakota camp. The 4 Hotchkiss guns were placed on a ridge overlooking the valley, their barrels trained down on the circle of teepees below. By morning, nearly 500 soldiers surrounded fewer than 350 Lakota, most of whom were women and children. As the sun rose on December 29, 1890, both sides prepared for what they hoped would be a peaceful conclusion to the pursuit. Neither anticipated that within hours, Wounded Knee would become synonymous with tragedy and controversy that continues to this day. Dawn broke clear and cold over Wounded Knee Creek. The temperature hovered near zero, and frost covered everything in the valley. Smoke rose from cooking fires in the Lakota camp as families prepared what many didn't know would be their last meal together. Colonel Forsyth had spent the night finalizing his plans. His orders from General Miles were explicit: disarm the Indians completely and escort them to the railroad for transport to a military prison in Nebraska. This wasn't just about ending the ghost dance, it was about removing potential troublemakers from the reservations permanently. At 8 a.m., Forsyth called for Bigfoot to meet with him near the center of camp. The sick chief was helped from his teepee and seated on the frozen ground, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Through interpreters, Forsyth explained that all weapons must be surrendered immediately. Bigfoot nodded weakly and gestured to his men. The first batch of surrendered weapons was disappointing, mostly old hunting rifles and a few pistols, many of them broken or nearly worthless. Forsyth had expected to find modern military weapons, evidence of the hostile preparations his intelligence reports had described. Frustrated by the small number of weapons produced, Forsyth ordered his soldiers to search the teepees directly. This decision violated cultural taboos and created immediate tension. Lakota women watched in horror as soldiers rifled through their personal belongings, tossing aside sacred objects and family possessions. The searches revealed only a few additional weapons: kitchen knives, hunting tools, and a couple more old rifles. But Forsyth wasn't satisfied. His scouts had reported that the band was heavily armed, and someone was lying. What happened next would spark a controversy that historians are still debating more than 130 years later. The official military account differs dramatically from Lakota oral histories, but the physical evidence tells its own story. As the weapon search continued, tension in the camp grew palpable. Young Lakota men, already humiliated by the treatment of their families, began to mutter angrily among themselves. Some wore ghost shirts under their winter clothing, believing the sacred garments would protect them from soldier bullets. Among them was a warrior named Black Coyote. Accounts describe him as possibly deaf or hard of hearing, and certainly frustrated by the morning's events. Black Coyote had paid a significant sum for his rifle, money his family desperately needed for food and supplies. He refused to surrender it without compensation. As soldiers approached Black Coyote, he raised the rifle over his head, apparently shouting that he had paid good money for the weapon and wouldn't give it up for nothing. 2 soldiers grabbed him from either side, trying to wrestle the gun away. In the struggle, the rifle discharged into the air. The single gunshot shattered the tense quiet of the winter morning. For a split second, everyone in the valley froze. Soldiers, Lakota families, even the horses seemed to pause. Then hell erupted at Wounded Knee Creek. Soldiers, primed for violence and terrified by months of ghost dance hysteria, opened fire immediately. The Lakota men, many of whom had concealed knives and hatchets under their blankets, fought back desperately. But they were facing trained troops with modern weapons. The initial firefight lasted only minutes, but it was incredibly intense. Lakota warriors, believing their ghost shirts would protect them, charged directly at soldier positions. Many fell within yards of their starting positions, their sacred garments providing no defense against military bullets. But this was only the beginning of the tragedy. As the hand-to-hand fighting raged in the center of camp, Colonel Forsyth made a decision that would forever stain his reputation. He ordered the Hotchkiss guns on the ridge to open fire on the entire camp. The 4 rapid-fire artillery pieces began throwing explosive shells into the valley at a rate of nearly 1 round per second. Each shell contained enough explosive power to kill or wound multiple people, and they were being fired indiscriminately into an area filled with families. The Hotchkiss guns couldn't distinguish between warriors and children, between those fighting and those trying to flee. The shells exploded among the teepees, shredding the canvas structures and anyone inside them. Within minutes, the neat circle of the Lakota camp had been transformed into a hellscape of smoke, fire, and screaming. Lakota families scattered in every direction, running toward any cover they could find. Many headed for a ravine about half a mile from the camp, hoping the natural depression would provide protection from the artillery barrage. But Forsyth had positioned soldiers along the likely escape routes. As families ran from the exploding camp, they encountered cavalry units that had orders to prevent anyone from leaving the area. What followed was a running battle across several miles of prairie, as desperate parents tried to protect their children from pursuing soldiers. The weather worked against the fleeing families. Snow made running difficult, especially for the elderly and very young. Tracks in the snow made it easy for soldiers to follow those who had escaped the initial massacre. Many families were hunted down miles from the original camp. Louise Weasel Bear, who was 7 years old at the time, later described seeing her mother shot down while carrying an infant. The baby fell into the snow and froze to death before Louise could reach them. Such stories were repeated dozens of times across the battlefield. Some Lakota warriors managed to retrieve weapons from fallen soldiers and fought back effectively. It was during this phase of the battle that 15 soldiers were killed, not in the initial chaotic firefight, but during the pursuit phase when scattered groups of warriors made desperate stands to protect their fleeing families. These 15 soldiers didn't die in a single engagement, but rather in small skirmishes spread across several hours and multiple locations. Some were killed when they pursued warriors into the ravine where families were hiding. Others died when they encountered armed groups trying to break through the military cordon to escape. The death of these soldiers would later be used to justify the entire operation, with military reports describing them as victims of a treacherous attack by the Lakota. But the timeline and circumstances suggest a different story. Soldiers dying while pursuing families who were desperately trying to survive a massacre. By noon, the shooting had largely ended. The winter sun shone down on a scene of unimaginable devastation. Bodies lay scattered across miles of prairie, many partially buried by the snow that had begun falling again. In the immediate aftermath of Wounded Knee, the military faced a public relations disaster. Reports of the battle began appearing in newspapers across the country, but the accounts varied wildly depending on their sources. Military dispatches described a heroic action against dangerous ghost dance fanatics who had treacherously attacked soldiers during a peaceful weapon surrender. These reports emphasized the 15 soldiers killed while minimizing Lakota casualties, initially claiming only about 30 Indians had died. But civilian witnesses told a different story. Correspondents who reached the battlefield described scenes that looked more like a massacre than a battle. Bodies of women and children were found miles from the original camp, shot in the back while trying to flee. Infants were discovered frozen in their dead mother's arms. Dr. Charles Eastman, a Dakota physician who was among the first to reach the scene after the shooting, described finding wounded survivors hiding in the ravine where many families had sought shelter. Some had been there for 3 days in sub-zero temperatures, too terrified to seek help. The true casualty count emerged slowly. While the military's 15 dead was accurate, the Lakota losses were catastrophic. Modern historians estimate that between 250 and 300 Lakota were killed at Wounded Knee, with at least 200 of them being women and children. Some bodies were never found, buried by snow and scavenged by animals over the winter. General Miles, who had not been present at Wounded Knee, was reportedly furious when he learned the full extent of what had occurred. He immediately began an investigation and relieved Colonel Forsyth of command, calling the action unnecessary and unjustifiable. But political pressure from Washington forced Miles to reverse his decision. The Harrison administration, facing criticism for its handling of Native American affairs, needed the Wounded Knee operation to be seen as a legitimate military action rather than a massacre of civilians. The controversy surrounding these events continues to this day, with some historians calling it the last battle of the Indian Wars while others classify it as a massacre. The evidence we've uncovered paints a complex picture of how fear, miscommunication, and institutional racism led to tragedy. 20 soldiers, including some of the 15 who died, were awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions at Wounded Knee, more medals of honor than were awarded for any other single engagement in American history. This fact alone has fueled decades of debate about how the military and government chose to remember these events. The Ghost Dance movement effectively ended with Wounded Knee. The shock of the massacre convinced most Native Americans that armed resistance was futile, and the spiritual revival that had promised to restore their world instead marked the final chapter of the Indian Wars. For the Lakota people, Wounded Knee became a symbol of government betrayal and military brutality. The site remained a place of mourning and remembrance, with families returning annually to honor their dead and maintain their cultural memory of what had occurred. The 15 soldiers who died were buried with military honors, their deaths officially recorded as casualties of combat against hostile forces. But the circumstances of their deaths, scattered across a pursuit that lasted hours rather than dying in a single battle, raised questions about whether Wounded Knee was truly the military victory it was portrayed to be. More than 130 years after Wounded Knee, historians continue to debate exactly what happened on that frozen December morning. The controversy centers not just on the events themselves, but on how they've been remembered and interpreted. The military's official account, established in the immediate aftermath, described Wounded Knee as a legitimate military action against hostile forces. According to this version, Ghost Dance practitioners had been preparing for war. Bigfoot's band was heavily armed and dangerous, and the soldiers acted in self-defense when treacherously attacked during a peaceful weapon surrender. This narrative was supported by the testimony of officers present at the scene, military investigation reports, and contemporary newspaper accounts that relied primarily on Army sources. The 15 soldier deaths were presented as evidence of the fierce resistance encountered and the hostile intent of the Lakota. But alternative accounts began emerging almost immediately. Civilian witnesses, including traders, missionaries, and Indian Agency employees, described scenes inconsistent with the military's version. They reported seeing soldiers firing indiscriminately into crowds of fleeing families and artillery being used against non-combatants. Lakota oral histories, preserved by survivors and passed down through generations, tell a radically different story. These accounts describe a peaceful surrender that turned into a massacre when nervous soldiers overreacted to an accidental gunshot. They emphasize that most of the dead were unarmed civilians and that the 15 soldiers died during a pursuit phase as desperate warriors tried to protect their families. Modern forensic analysis of the battlefield has provided additional evidence. Archaeologists studying the site have found bullet patterns and artifact distributions that support some aspects of both accounts while contradicting others. The physical evidence suggests that the fighting was more chaotic and widespread than early military reports indicated. The question of the 15 soldiers remains central to the debate. Military records show they died over several hours in different locations, not in a single coordinated attack. Some were found miles from the original camp, suggesting they died while pursuing fleeing families rather than in defensive actions. Recent scholarship has focused on the context surrounding Wounded Knee rather than just the events of December 29th. The Ghost Dance movement, the military buildup, the death of Sitting Bull, and the general state of government-Indian relations all contributed to creating conditions where tragedy was almost inevitable. What's clear is that Wounded Knee represented the collision of two worldviews, a desperate native spiritual revival meeting an inflexible military and political system that saw any form of Indian resistance as an existential threat. The site itself has become a place of ongoing controversy and commemoration. In 1973, members of the American Indian Movement occupied Wounded Knee for 71 days, drawing national attention to ongoing issues of native rights and government treatment of tribal peoples. Today, Wounded Knee stands as more than just a historical site. It represents the complex and often painful relationship between the United States government and Native American peoples. The events of December 29, 1890, marked the effective end of the Indian Wars, but they also established patterns of misunderstanding and conflict that continue to influence American society. The 15 soldiers who died at Wounded Knee became symbols of different things to different people. For the military and many Americans of the time, they represented the sacrifices made to secure the frontier and establish order. For Native Americans and modern historians, their deaths became part of a larger tragedy that encompassed the destruction of an entire way of life. What makes Wounded Knee particularly tragic is that it was probably preventable. The ghost dance movement, despite fears about its militant potential, was fundamentally peaceful and spiritual. The military buildup that led to the confrontation was based largely on misunderstanding and fear rather than genuine threat assessment. Bigfoot's band was not an army preparing for war. It was a community of families seeking refuge and hope in desperate circumstances. The weapons found in their possession were hunting tools and old rifles, not the modern military equipment that intelligence reports had suggested. The institutional factors that led to Wounded Knee, racial prejudice, miscommunication between civilian and military authorities, fear of cultural movements not understood by outsiders, remain relevant to understanding conflicts around the world today. The story of Wounded Knee reminds us that historical events are rarely as simple as they first appear. Official accounts don't always capture the full truth, and understanding requires listening to multiple perspectives, especially those of people whose voices have been marginalized or ignored. For the Lakota people, Wounded Knee is not ancient history. It's a living memory that shapes their relationship with the federal government and American society. The site remains a place of pilgrimage and protest, where people gather to remember the dead and call for justice. The massacre at Wounded Knee ended the ghost dance movement and the Indian Wars, but it couldn't end the spiritual and cultural traditions of Native peoples. Today, more than a century later, Lakota communities continue to practice their traditions, speak their language, and honor the memory of those who died on that frozen December morning. As we reflect on this tragic chapter of American history, we're reminded that the price of misunderstanding and fear is often paid by the most vulnerable members of society. The 15 soldiers and nearly 300 Lakota who died at Wounded Knee all became casualties of a conflict that might have been avoided if leaders on both sides had chosen understanding over suspicion. Their story continues to resonate because it speaks to universal themes of cultural survival, the abuse of power, and the human cost of fear. Wounded Knee challenges us to remember not just what happened, but why it happened, and what we can learn from this dark chapter to prevent similar tragedies in the future.